And do you think that the next time it crumbles and falls, that when you go to pick up the phone to call me to save you, that I'm going to be there?
I promise. I won't come to you.
You're more full of than a Christmas goose.
No.
Yes, you are. Everybody's got stress in their life. And then to say, I'm under stress, so I'm going to laugh.
Forrest couldn't believe what he was seeing. His hands frozen over Sheena's phone as the realization hit him like a punch straight to the chest. Molly had been snooping again, going through private messages that had absolutely nothing to do with her. Every protective instinct he had for his mother was clashing with the sense of betrayal that burned hotter than anything he'd felt before. Sheena, standing a few feet away, looked torn between shock and anger, and in that moment, the air in the house felt thick enough to choke on. It wasn't the first time Molly had overstepped boundaries, but seeing it with his own eyes, Molly peering into Sheena's private conversations, was a breaking point he couldn't ignore. Every rule she had ever bent, every moment of control she had exerted over the household suddenly came rushing back. Money, schedules, family decisions, even casual friendships, Molly had a way of inserting herself into every corner of their lives, always insisting it was for everyone's good, yet somehow it always felt more like a cage. Forrest's mind raced, trying to piece together whether confronting her now would explode into something unmanageable, or if silence would only let the pattern continue. The tension between wanting to defend Sheena and fearing his mother's wrath twisted inside him, and just for a second he froze, staring at the screen that had revealed everything. Sheena's eyes met his, full of unspoken question. The anger in her gaze was sharp, but underneath it was a vulnerability that cut even deeper. She had endured Molly's controlling behavior for months, tolerating overbearing comments, unsolicited advice, and constant interference, all while keeping a brave face. And now, with proof in front of them, the weight of it all settled like a stone in the pit of her stomach. It was one thing to feel manipulated, to sense the constant monitoring, but seeing the messages laid bare changed everything. The emotional impact was immediate. Forrest's jaw tightened as frustration and disbelief collided, and Sheena's hands shook slightly, a small but telling sign of how tightly she had been holding her composure. It wasn't about being dramatic, it was about feeling the boundaries of personal life trampled repeatedly, and realizing that the very person who should have been supportive had been overstepping in ways that threatened the trust between them. And Molly, well, she had always been a force in the house, protective to a fault, insisting she knew best in nearly every situation. But there was a line, and it had been crossed. Forrest and Sheena both knew that the problem wasn't her intentions alone. The issue was the way she consistently inserted herself where she didn't belong, using secrecy and manipulation rather than conversation. She had managed to turn her care into control, her advice into interference, and her protection into a weapon that created tension rather than comfort. Every time she justified a controlling move with "it's for your own good," it left a mark, an invisible wall of resentment that was slowly building between everyone under that roof. It was exhausting, confusing, and emotionally draining, and the discovery on the phone made it crystal clear that the tension could no longer be ignored. Forrest's mind flicked rapidly between scenarios: confrontation, compromise, avoidance. Each possibility carried its own risk. If he spoke up now, would Molly listen, or would it erupt into chaos, as it often did when she felt cornered? If he stayed silent, would Sheena feel abandoned, left to face the manipulation on her own? And the worst part, the unspoken question that hovered like smoke in the room: how long had Molly been monitoring things like this without them realizing it? Every text, every message, every private thought that had been exposed weighed on them both, and the room seemed to shrink around the intensity of the revelation. At that precise moment, From TLC Drama Live would want viewers to pause and consider what they would do in this situation, and she'd want you to be part of the conversation, to comment and weigh in, because this is exactly the kind of drama that leaves people talking for days. If you've ever felt like someone in your life was overstepping, or you've been caught in a situation where trust was betrayed, this is the scene that makes your heart race, your fingers hover over the keyboard, and your curiosity spiral. Subscribe to TLC Drama Live to see every angle of this story, to watch Forrest and Sheena navigate the impossible, and to join a community that thrives on real reactions and real emotion. The house, already heavy with tension, grew even tighter as they stood there, contemplating the next move. Forrest's mind couldn't stop racing, trying to figure out how to respond without igniting a confrontation he might regret. Sheena's pulse quickened, aware that nothing would ever be the same after this moment, and Molly, somewhere just beyond the threshold of understanding what she had done, remained oblivious to the storm she had ignited. The question now hung in the air. Would Forrest confront her and demand accountability, or would silence give her more power to manipulate and control the household in secret, continuing the cycle that had been quietly building for months? This was the breaking point. The moment when protective instincts collided with betrayal, and when the invisible lines that had been ignored for too long suddenly mattered more than anyone could have imagined. And as viewers, you feel it too. Because everyone has been in a moment where trust is tested, and every decision from here on out has the potential to change the course of everything. For months, the tension in Forrest and Sheena's household had been quietly simmering, a pressure cooker ready to explode, and Molly's behavior had been at the center of it all. It wasn't a single act that created this storm. It was the accumulation of countless small invasions, each one seeming insignificant on its own, but together forming a pattern that eroded trust and peace. Sheena had noticed it first in finance, Molly inserting herself into decisions that weren't hers, questioning every expense, insisting she knew what was best for the household. A simple dinner purchase became a debate. A trip to the store turned into a lecture, all couched in the language of care and concern. Forrest tried to step in, to create boundaries, but every attempt was met with subtle manipulation, guilt, or the persistent reminder that she was only trying to help. Over time, the couple started to feel like their lives were no longer entirely their own, each decision shadowed by Molly's watchful eye. It wasn't only money. Molly had a way of inserting herself into personal spaces that should have been sacred. Bedrooms, living spaces, private conversations, it didn't matter where, she found a way to make her presence felt. Friends visiting the house felt the tension immediately, picking up on a silent rulebook that no one had agreed to but everyone had learned to follow. Sheena's personal time became a minefield, every phone call and text subtly monitored, every gesture silently judged. The emotional toll was cumulative, and even Forrest, who had grown up accustomed to his mother's strong personality, found himself questioning what was normal and what was overstepping. When protection turns into control, even the closest family can start to feel like strangers under surveillance, and it's exhausting to live in a space where every choice might be critiqued or undermined. The secret recordings were perhaps the most alarming. Sheena had found traces before, little hints that conversations had been recorded without her knowledge, but nothing concrete until the phone incident confirmed it. These weren't just casual notes. They were deliberate attempts to keep tabs, to anticipate reactions, to have a sense of control over information that wasn't hers. Watching someone you love manipulate the lines of privacy is shocking. And for Forrest, the combination of these secret intrusions with constant over-involvement in personal and financial matters was almost unbearable. He realized that his protective instincts toward both Molly and Sheena had collided violently, leaving him stuck in a moral and emotional dilemma. How do you defend one person without harming another? And as he wrestled with these questions, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Psychologically, people often cross these boundaries when their protective instincts are extreme. When someone genuinely believes they are preventing harm, they rationalize control, monitoring, and interference as care rather than intrusion. It starts small, but over time, these justifications compound, and the line between help and domination blurred. It's easy to empathize with the intention, yet the consequences can be devastating. Emotional exhaustion, distrust, resentment all grow quietly under the guise of concern. And when the protective behavior is aimed at multiple areas of life, money, relationships, personal choices, the person on the receiving end begins to feel suffocated, unsure of what is acceptable to defend and what is worth surrendering. Forrest and Sheena were living that exact paradox, and every new example of Molly's intrusion felt like a new layer of pressure added to an already unstable foundation. Even now, while they tried to navigate daily life, small incidents kept reminding them that nothing had changed. A misdirected comment, an unsolicited suggestion, a lingering presence at a private conversation, it all built tension that could explode at any moment. The constant vigilance required to manage these situations left Sheena particularly vulnerable, emotionally and mentally drained. And yet, each time they thought they had seen the full extent of Molly's interference, Another example appeared, more subtle but equally intrusive, leaving the couple scrambling to maintain their own boundaries while preserving a semblance of household peace. And then it happened. Sheena stumbled across something she hadn't seen before, hidden in plain sight within a message thread. The wording was vague, almost innocuous at first glance, but the timing and context suggested that Molly's intentions were far from transparent. Was this another layer of surveillance, a new attempt to control, or a misunderstood action? The uncertainty itself was suffocating. Forrest and Sheena exchanged looks that carried a mix of worry and suspicion, knowing that any decision made next could either prevent further intrusion or ignite a new conflict. And while they tried to gather their thoughts, questions raced through their minds. How far is too far for family involvement? At what point does protection cross the line into manipulation? And what exactly was Molly planning next, hidden just beneath the surface of her words and action? The atmosphere in the house grew heavy, anticipation simmering. Because even as they tried to protect themselves from more overreach, the unknown message lingered, a reminder that Molly's control was far from over, and that the next revelation could change everything. Sheena had been holding it together for months, but the weight of Molly's constant interference was finally beginning to crush her. Every morning she woke up anticipating another unsolicited critique, another subtle jab disguised as concern. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee, a small but telling sign of how deeply the tension had seeped into her daily life. She had tried to rationalize it, telling herself that Molly's actions were rooted in love, that she only wanted what was best for Forrest and the household. But rationalization can only hold for so long, and the discovery of the hidden messages on her phone made it impossible to ignore the pattern of intrusion. Each secret act, every financial overstep, and every invasion of privacy had accumulated into an emotional burden that left her feeling trapped in her own home. Even her laughter felt forced, a thin veil over the anxiety that churned in her chest. Forrest's frustration, by contrast, was fiery and direct. He paced through the living room, voice low but taut, trying to process what Molly had done this time. He couldn't understand how someone could repeatedly cross boundaries with such persistence and then act as if nothing had happened. While Sheena's stress manifested in quiet tension, Forrest was explosive. A storm of disbelief and anger contained within clenched fists and sharp glances. Their perspectives contrasted sharply, but both were fueled by the same truth. Their household, their sanctuary, was being infiltrated by someone whose behavior had crossed the line. Watching him struggle to contain his anger, Sheena felt a mixture of relief and fear. Relief that someone was finally matching the intensity of the situation. Fear that confrontation could spiral out of control if not handled carefully. The psychological dynamics at play were complicated. Molly's pattern of manipulation wasn't overtly hostile, which made it insidiously effective. Gaslighting, subtle threats of guilt, and repeated questioning of boundaries created an environment where Sheena and Forrest constantly second-guessed themselves. Each denial, each excuse from Molly was carefully crafted to redirect attention away from her action, leaving the couple wondering if they were overreacting, if the problem was really as serious as it seemed. And yet, the evidence was undeniable. The recordings, the financial meddling, the secret messages, all pointing to a calculated series of intrusions that left Sheena feeling destabilized. Her mind raced constantly, trying to protect herself emotionally while also maintaining a sense of calm for Forrest, who relied on her as much as she relied on him. The emotional labor was immense, and the tension between them, though unspoken, hummed like electricity through the house. Sheena's anxiety also manifested in heightened sensitivity to every small interaction with Molly. A casual comment about a household expense could trigger hours of internal worry. A misplaced glance in the kitchen might feel like surveillance. It wasn't paranoia. It was the natural consequence of living under constant manipulation, where every decision and action could be observed, critiqued, or twisted to serve someone else's narrative. Forrest, seeing this, struggled to understand the quiet erosion of her confidence. His frustration was externalized in confrontation and discussion. Hers was internalized, a slow burn that threatened to overwhelm her at any moment. Together, their emotional states created a dynamic tension in the home. A clash of fire and water, anger and anxiety, outward expression and inward turmoil, all orbiting the center of Molly's repeated intrusions. The couple's conversations became a delicate dance, carefully navigating the minefield Molly had laid. Each word had to be chosen with precision, each reaction measured, because they knew that any misstep could be used against them. Forrest wanted immediate action, to confront Molly head-on, to expose the wrongdoing and demand accountability. Sheena, on the other hand, worried about the fallout, about escalation, about the emotional cost of a direct confrontation. The internal conflict between action and caution created a tension that neither of them could fully relieve, a pressure that grew heavier with every passing day. And then came the quiet, almost imperceptible moments that left the biggest mark. Sheena catching Molly lingering near her personal space, Forrest finding subtle hints of interference in their household routines, each one a reminder that the problem was far from resolved. The question that hung over them now was simple yet terrifying. How would they confront Molly? Together, presenting a united front, or separately, allowing her to manipulate one against the other? The stakes were high, emotions raw, and every decision had the potential to either end the cycle or intensify it. As Sheena sat quietly, heart pounding, Forrest by her side, the unspoken question lingered in the air, thick and heavy. Could they handle this confrontation as a team, or would Molly's tactics succeed in dividing them before the battle even began? Forrest didn't wait another second. The weight of months of intrusion, secret recordings, and constant monitoring had built to a pressure that could no longer be ignored. He found Molly in the kitchen, casually sipping her coffee as if nothing had happened, her expression calm but eyes sharp with awareness. Forrest took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm inside him, but as soon as the words left his mouth, the tension crackled through the room like electricity. He asked her directly, pointing to Sheena's phone, the evidence of her latest intrusion glaring in his hand. For a moment, silence hung heavy, and Molly blinked slowly as if processing the accusation. Then she smiled just slightly and said she had no idea what he was talking about. Denial. Classic. Forrest felt his jaw tighten. He knew better. She wasn't ignorant, she was strategic. Molly moved quickly, shifting the conversation, deflecting with a comment about how Forrest and Sheena needed to be more organized with their messages, subtly implying that the fault somehow lay with them. Manipulation wrapped in casual advice. Forrest's frustration flared. This was the pattern he had been fighting against for months. He wasn't attacking her as a person, but he was calling out behavior that was invasive and controlling. And that distinction was crucial, because it meant the confrontation wasn't about tearing anyone down, it was about establishing boundaries and reclaiming their space. Behavior can be corrected. Identity cannot. He reminded himself of that as he spoke, keeping his tone firm but measured, refusing to get pulled into emotional traps. Sheena watched from the corner, heart racing, seeing Forrest attempt to hold Molly accountable while also shielding her from a direct emotional blow. She could feel the tension radiating off them both. Every time Molly deflected, her stomach sank a little deeper. Every subtle attempt to guilt or manipulate made the room feel smaller, tighter, as though the walls themselves were pressing in. The psychological gymnastics were exhausting, and the audience watching at home could probably already feel the fatigue just in the way Forrest and Sheena's expression shifted, the way words were measured, the pauses stretched. Molly's tactics weren't new. She had always been adept at twisting situations, framing concern as oversight, turning helpfulness into control. Forrest had learned to recognize the patterns, to separate her behavior from her person, but it didn't make it any less frustrating. Every comment had layers, every denial had undertone. And the most maddening part was how quickly she could flip any conversation back on the couple, making them question their own reaction. She had made this a game where logic and emotion collided, where guilt was a weapon and trust was negotiable. Watching her maneuver, it became almost mesmerizing and terrifying. Now the audience has to ask themselves, who's being reasonable here? Forrest is standing up for his household, calling out invasive behavior that crosses the line again and again. Molly is insisting she's acting in everyone's best interest, that she's only trying to protect, to prevent mistake. If you were in Sheena or Forrest's shoes, who would you believe? Who would you side with? The tension is real because both positions can feel justified in isolation, but the pattern and repeated intrusion make the situation deeply complicated. That's the brilliance and horror of manipulative behavior. It hides in the gray, making everyone question what's right. Molly's eyes flicked between them, calculating. She wasn't about to let herself be cornered without a fight. Slowly, she began to flip the narrative, turning Forrest's confrontation into proof that he and Sheena were overreacting, exaggerating, even plotting against her. She painted herself as the victim, framing months of clear boundary crossing as concern misinterpreted. Forrest's frustration surged and Sheena's anxiety spiked, but they had to stay grounded, aware that reacting to the twist could only give her more leverage. It was a tense standoff, a psychological chess match played in the middle of the kitchen, and every word mattered. The energy in the house was thick, and the stakes felt enormous. Forrest had called out behavior, demanded accountability, and yet Molly's ability to manipulate, deflect, and invert the story left them questioning the next move. Could they press further without letting her control the narrative? Or would her twisting of the facts buy her more time and space to interfere yet again? The answer wasn't clear, and as they exchanged looks, measuring strategy against emotion, the unspoken question loomed: how would they navigate this next step without losing themselves to the chaos Molly had already sown? Sheena took a slow, steadying breath, feeling the weight of months of stress finally press down on her chest in a way she could no longer ignore. This wasn't just about a few crossed lines or harmless interference anymore. This was a pattern of control, manipulation, and secretive behavior that had slowly infiltrated every corner of their home. Sitting across from Forrest, she finally allowed herself to admit what she had been trying to suppress. Molly's actions weren't just annoying, they were eroding the trust and safety that should have existed in their household. Every late-night intrusion, every unsolicited critique, every secret recording had left her exhausted, anxious, and questioning her own sense of reality. It wasn't just the immediate violations, it was the cumulative emotional toll that left her feeling trapped, as if she was constantly walking on eggshells, never certain when the next invasion would occur. Forrest noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor. The tension that had always separated them in moments of disagreement, his fiery frustration against her quiet anxiety, began to dissolve as they both recognized the gravity of the situation. Sheena's acknowledgement of the problem gave him clarity. They couldn't allow Molly's behavior to continue unchecked. For the first time in weeks, the couple felt aligned, their perspectives converging in a rare moment of shared understanding. No longer would they face these violations individually. They had to present a united front if they were going to protect themselves and their relationship. The emotional stakes were high, but together they felt capable of taking the first steps toward reclaiming their home and establishing the boundaries that had been ignored for far too long. This wasn't easy. The decision to confront such ingrained patterns of control carried risk, escalating conflict, emotional blowouts, and the possibility that Molly would dig in even harder. But staying silent had proven far worse. The couple had endured sleepless nights, constant vigilance, and the creeping erosion of their peace, all because the line between protection and intrusion had been blurred beyond recognition. The psychological toll was real, manifesting in subtle but powerful ways. Sheena's heart racing at small interaction, Forrest's frustration simmering just beneath the surface, both of them exhausted by the constant mental labor of anticipating Molly's next move. Emotional exhaustion, feelings of helplessness, and the weight of repeated boundary violations had created a pressure cooker environment, and Sheena realized that acting wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. As they talked quietly in the living room, laying out every instance of interference, every overstep, the couple began to strategize. Each example, financial meddling, secret recordings, unsolicited advice, was cataloged, and they discussed calmly, methodically what it meant for their household. They knew that confronting Molly individually had only fueled her manipulations before, so this time they would present a united, unwavering front. The unity itself became empowering, transforming fear and frustration into determination. The simple act of acknowledging each other's experiences, validating their shared feelings of invasion and betrayal, became a form of strength they hadn't realized they possessed. Sheena's perspective was particularly poignant. Living under continuous intrusion doesn't just wear on your patience, it chips away at your confidence, your sense of autonomy, and your ability to feel safe in your own environment. When the person crossing lines is someone you're supposed to trust, the psychological effects multiply. Every decision feels scrutinized, every interaction weighed, and every private moment becomes vulnerable. It's exhausting, disorienting, and emotionally draining. But Sheena's realization that she didn't have to endure it alone, and that Forrest was beside her, fully aligned, gave her a renewed sense of agency. They weren't just reacting, they were taking action with purpose, clarity, and unity. opportunity. And yet, as they solidified their plan, a new question emerged, hanging over them like a shadow. Should they confront Molly privately, hoping for a resolution within the household, or escalate matters to the producers of the show, exposing the pattern of behavior in a way that could hold her accountable publicly? Both options carried risks, both required courage, and neither offered an immediate sense of certainty. The tension was almost unbearable, the anticipation thick, because this decision would determine not just the outcome of the immediate conflict, but the emotional climate of their home going forward. In that moment, as Sheena's resolve crystallized and Forrest's frustration tempered into focus, the couple realized the gravity of the choice before them. They were standing at a crossroads. One path promised private confrontation with uncertain result. The other offered exposure and accountability, but with the potential for a dramatic escalation that could redefine their relationships entirely. The emotional stakes, the psychological pressure, and the sheer weight of past violations combined to make the next critical. And as the couple looked at each other, united in understanding and intent, the question remained: how would they proceed? And what consequences would follow once they made their choice? Forrest and Sheena had talked it through, weighed every option, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in their decision. Reporting Molly wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming control over their home and protecting their relationship. The line had been crossed too many times, the intrusions too numerous, and the emotional toll too heavy. They gathered the evidence that had accumulated over months, secret recordings of private conversations that proved a consistent pattern of monitoring, detailed records of financial interference showing Molly had inserted herself into purchases and decisions that weren't hers, and subtle but deliberate acts of sabotage that had disrupted their personal and social lives. Each piece told a story, each moment documented the repeated overreach, and together they painted a picture that could no longer be ignored. Forrest carefully organized everything, making sure each example was clear and chronological. It wasn't about piling blame, it was about showing a consistent pattern of behavior that could no longer be explained away as concern or care. Sheena supported him every step of the way, recalling incidents she had internalized for months but never voiced, adding context and clarity that made the evidence impossible to dismiss. It was a painstaking process, but necessary. This wasn't a casual complaint, it was a formal, undeniable record of ongoing boundary violation. For Sheena, finally giving voice to the stress, fear, and anxiety that had been simmering inside her was a relief. It validated months of silent suffering and offered a chance to finally feel heard and protected. Psychologically, reporting Molly publicly offered a layer of safety they couldn't achieve privately. Confronting someone in isolation, no matter how carefully you approach it, carries the risk of denial, deflection, or gaslighting. When the situation is documented and witnessed by an outside authority, the manipulator's usual tactics lose power. Molly had repeatedly flipped conversations, cast doubt on their reactions, and redirected blame. Facing her in front of producers created a controlled environment where Forrest and Sheena's claims could be evaluated based on evidence rather than emotion or manipulation. The public confrontation wasn't about humiliation, it was about accountability, about breaking the cycle of control, and about establishing a boundary that could not be ignored. When they presented the evidence to the producers, the weight of months of tension hung in the room. Forrest and Sheena laid out every detail with calm precision. The hidden recordings that proved Molly's intrusive monitoring, the financial meddling that had caused repeated stress and conflict, and the personal sabotage that had left them questioning their own decisions. The producers listened, taking notes, asking questions, and acknowledging the seriousness of the behavior. For the first time, the couple felt like the situation was being seen for what it truly was, not dismissed or rationalized. The validation was a relief, but it also escalated the stake. Now, the behavior would not go unnoticed, and the consequences could ripple far beyond the walls of their household. Molly, when confronted by the producers, reacted exactly as Forrest and Sheena had anticipated. At first, there was disbelief, the kind of wide-eyed denial designed to buy time and diffuse tension. Then came deflection, turning small examples into misunderstandings, minimizing the impact, and attempting to paint herself as misunderstood or unfairly judged. But as the producers reviewed the evidence, her attempts to control the narrative began to falter. The recordings, the documented interference, and the clear examples of personal sabotage were undeniable. The room felt electric with tension, the kind of charged energy that only comes from the collision of long simmering conflict and accountability. And then Molly's reaction escalated further. Her frustration shifted into visible agitation, her voice rising, her gestures sharp and defensive. She tried to flip the narrative, suggesting that Forrest and Sheena were overreacting, exaggerating, or even plotting against her. But with the evidence laid out and the producers present, her manipulations had less power, though the emotional intensity in the room spiked. Forrest remained firm, Sheena steady, both aware that they were navigating a volatile moment that could erupt at any second. The drama had reached a new level, and the anticipation of what Molly might do next, the next outburst, the next desperate attempt to regain control, hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. As viewers, you can feel the tension yourself, because the situation isn't just a confrontation, it's the culmination of months of emotional stress, manipulation, and boundary violation. Forrest and Sheena's choice to report Molly publicly has shifted the dynamic, but it has also opened the door to new drama. Molly's reaction promises that the situation is far from resolved. Every glance, every word, every movement now carries the potential for escalation. The stage is set for the next meltdown, and the audience can already sense the emotional fireworks about to unfold, leaving everyone on edge, eager to see how the next chapter will play out. Molly's composure finally snapped. Months of pressure, repeated confrontations, and public exposure had pushed her to a point where calm denial no longer sufficed. On camera, in front of Forrest, Sheena, and the producers, her voice rose sharply, trembling with a mixture of anger and desperation. Words came fast, almost uncontrollably. Claims of being misunderstood, accusations that she had been unfairly judged, and the familiar deflections that had always been her first line of defense. Every gesture, every sharp glance, every rapid hand movement amplified the emotional intensity, making it clear that the boundaries she had so often ignored were now turning back on her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Watching her, it was hard not to feel the full weight of the emotional energy in the room. Forrest remained steady, holding his ground without raising his voice, his eyes locked on the evidence that had forced this confrontation. Sheena, sitting nearby, fought to maintain her own composure, heart pounding as she listened to Molly's torrent of words. It was a chaotic scene, yet there was an underlying pattern in Molly's behavior that a careful observer could detect. Denial, blame shifting, and verbal intensity were not random. They were calculated responses aimed at regaining control and undermining the couple's united front. From a human-centric perspective, Molly's outburst was a textbook example of someone reacting when their usual strategies of subtle manipulation and private control are suddenly made public. The shouting, the rapid-fire accusations, and the emotional theatrics were less about truth and more about attempting to reclaim dominance in a situation where her influence had been reduced. She was trying to force the narrative back into familiar territory, where her actions could be reframed as caring concern rather than invasive overreach. The energy was raw and highly charged, and it was impossible not to feel the tension ripple through the room as everyone braced for the next move. As viewers, it's striking to see how behavior can escalate under pressure without it being a personal attack. Molly's identity wasn't being questioned. Her repeated choices and patterns of control were being challenged. The distinction is subtle but important. It's possible to analyze and respond to behavior while still acknowledging the person behind it. Forrest and Sheena's calm focus amidst the chaos highlighted this perfectly. They weren't retaliating emotionally, they were observing, documenting, and maintaining boundaries, refusing to be drawn into a cycle of drama that had long defined their interactions with Molly. The emotional stakes in this moment were immense. Every shout, every tear, and every word was a test of endurance for Forrest and Sheena. Sheena's mind raced as she tried to balance empathy with self-preservation. It's natural to want to de-escalate, to calm someone who is visibly distraught, yet the challenge here was distinguishing between genuine remorse and manipulative theatrics. How much do you engage, and how much do you hold firm? Sheena's perspective in this moment would shape not just the rest of the confrontation, but the ongoing emotional landscape of their household. Audience engagement becomes unavoidable here. What would you do if you were in Sheena's place? Would you respond in kind, trying to match Molly's intensity, or maintain composure, allowing the evidence and facts to speak for themselves? Would you step back and create space, or confront the emotional storm head on? This is the dilemma she faced, and it's one that viewers can feel viscerally because it mirrors real-life scenarios of conflict, manipulation, and emotional pressure. Molly's energy continued to spike, her statements looping back on themselves, trying to shift blame while simultaneously justifying her action. Her attempts to recast herself as the victim collided with the meticulously documented evidence Forrest and Sheena had presented. It was an intense collision of emotional narrative, Molly's desperate need to regain control versus the couple's firm, grounded reality of boundary violation. And yet, the tension didn't resolve. The room felt like it could explode further at any moment, every word a spark, every glance a challenge. By the end of this outburst, one question hung in the air, thick and almost unbearable. Would Molly leave the household to cool down, or would she retaliate further, doubling down on manipulation and control? Forrest and Sheena's next steps could either contain the situation or inadvertently escalate it. The unpredictability of her next move kept everyone on edge, including the viewers watching from home, because the drama wasn't just unfolding, it was escalating, each moment feeding the anticipation for what would come next. Every heart in the room seemed to pause, waiting for the answer that could redefine the dynamics of the household entirely. Within hours of Molly's on-camera outburst, clips of the confrontation flooded social media. Viewers couldn't get enough. The intensity, the shouting, the raw emotion, it was everything that makes reality TV addictive. Short clips highlighting Molly's denial, Forrest's calm firmness, and Sheena's tense yet determined composure went viral almost instantly. Fans dissected every frame, every expression, every word. Comments poured in by the thousands, each person taking sides, theorizing motives, and debating who was in the right. Some praised Forrest and Sheena for standing united, calling it a masterclass in boundary enforcement, while others empathized with Molly, arguing that protective instincts sometimes get misinterpreted. The conversation didn't just stay in comment threads. Hashtags began trending globally. Hashtag Molly crossed the line, hashtag Forrest and Sheena expose, and hashtag 90-day drama exploded across Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, pushing clips to millions of viewers who hadn't even seen the original episode yet. The viral reaction added a new layer of pressure. Suddenly, this wasn't just a household dispute, it had become a public spectacle with reputational stake. Reality TV thrives on this amplification, where social media acts as both judge and jury, sometimes intensifying the conflict far beyond the original incident. Viewers could feel the tension as if they were in the room themselves, reacting to each accusation, each defensive gesture, and each emotional peak. The emotional intensity that Forrest and Sheena experienced within the home now resonated with a global audience, creating a feedback loop. Social media attention heightened the drama, and the drama fueled even more online engagement. Every post, share, and comment added weight to the confrontation, pressuring all parties to respond or risk losing credibility in the eyes of millions. Psychologically, public exposure can change the stakes dramatically. Molly, who had thrived in private manipulation and subtle control, now faced scrutiny that she couldn't easily redirect. When behavior is made visible on a massive platform, denial loses much of its power. Every viewer who watched the clip, replayed the emotional spikes, and analyzed her gestures became part of the accountability mechanism. Forrest and Sheena, by contrast, benefited from this transparency. Their measured reactions and calm presentation of evidence position them as credible and rational in the public eye. The very tools Molly had used for influence in private, gaslighting, misdirection, emotional pressure, were now neutralized by the presence of millions of witnesses. The engagement didn't stop at praise or condemnation. Fans began to speculate endlessly. Will Molly retaliate? Is this the breaking point for the household? How far will she go? Every post invited more attention, more conversation, more debate. Memes and reaction videos flooded YouTube, recreating the shouting, the tense pauses, the moments of raw emotion. Viewers weren't just consuming drama, They were participating in it, reacting, theorizing, and predicting the next move. Forrest and Sheena's choice to report Molly publicly had triggered a social media wildfire, and the flames kept spreading. For Molly, the online explosion was both threatening and tantalizing. She watched as her actions were dissected frame by frame, every denial and outburst replayed endlessly. The pressure mounted, and her frustration became palpable. She realized that public scrutiny could undermine her attempts at control, but it also offered her a chance to craft a narrative, to respond with a countermove that could regain some of the influence she had lost. The tension escalated further as she hinted through a cryptic social media post and pointed comments during interviews that she wasn't done, that a response was coming, and that Forrest and Sheena might not have seen the full extent of her plan. For viewers, the suspense was electric. Would she escalate publicly using social media as a weapon? Would she attempt to discredit the couple with selective stories, emotional appeals, or behind-the-scenes revelation? Or would she retreat, letting the viral outrage define her in the public eye? The uncertainty drove endless speculation, fueling shares, comments, and debate. Every new clip, every trending hashtag, every viral snippet served as both evidence and catalyst, intensifying the drama and leaving audiences craving the next installment. The social media explosion didn't just magnify the conflict, it transformed it into a multi-layered narrative, where every participant, Molly, Forrest, Sheena, and millions of viewers, played a role in escalating or diffusing the tension. It became a living, breathing drama unfolding in real time, where the audience wasn't merely observing, they were actively shaping the story. And just as it seemed the drama had peaked, Molly's subtle threats hinted at what could come next, leaving everyone on edge, wondering whether the next move would escalate the chaos even further, or finally force a resolution. After the social media storm, the cameras were off, but the tension in the household lingered like a thick fog. Forrest and Sheena sat together quietly, processing what had just unfolded, and the emotional aftermath was heavier than either had anticipated. On screen, everything had seemed dramatic, loud, and confrontational, but in private, the stress was quieter, subtle, yet all-consuming. Sheena's hand shook slightly as she recounted the months of feeling monitored, critiqued, and controlled, while Forrest's jaw clenched, the residue of frustration from trying to assert boundaries still simmering under the surface. The intensity of public attention didn't erase the personal toll. If anything, it amplified it. Every viral clip, every trending hashtag, every judgmental or supportive comment from fans was another reminder that the personal conflict had become a public spectacle, adding an extra layer of pressure that neither could escape. It was striking to notice the contrast between the world outside and the reality inside. Online, Forrest and Sheena were praised as heroes of boundary setting, as people who had finally called out controlling behavior and stood united in the face of manipulation. Molly's outburst dominated headlines, her emotional escalation framed as evidence of overstepping. But inside the house, the emotional cost was real, raw, and ongoing. Sleep was harder to find, meals were quieter, and even moments of calm carried the echo of recent conflict. Every glance across the room reminded them of the tension that had been brewing for months and the uncertainty of what might come next. The private reality wasn't glamorous or viral. It was exhausting, draining, and emotionally complicated. Reflecting on their experiences, Forrest and Sheena began to see patterns that were both familiar and instructive. It became clear that the repeated boundary violations were not about personal dislike or malice, they were the result of extreme protective instinct, combined with a lack of respect for autonomy. Understanding this didn't make it easier, but it helped frame the situation in a way that was actionable rather than purely reactive. The psychological weight of having someone constantly intrude into finances, relationships, and personal space creates a slow erosion of trust and confidence. Recognizing the difference between intent and impact was key. They could acknowledge that Molly may have thought she was helping, while still holding firm to the boundaries that had been repeatedly ignored. For viewers, there's a lesson in these dynamics. Healthy boundaries in family relationships are not negotiable if the goal is mutual respect and emotional safety. Interference disguised as concern often escalates tension rather than resolving it, and repeated intrusion without consent can erode trust, create stress, and damage the fabric of everyday life. Forrest and Sheena's experience illustrates the importance of consistent communication, clear expectations, and standing together when boundaries are challenged. It also highlights that confronting a problem doesn't need to involve personal attacks or humiliation. It's about behavior, evidence, and mutual respect. Even as they reflected, there was a lingering sense of unpredictability. Molly's public hints of a countermove, combined with the unresolved tension at home, created an ongoing sense of unease. Forrest and Sheena couldn't ignore the possibility that she might escalate further, whether privately or publicly. The emotional energy of the household remained high, and every interaction carried the potential for conflict even after months of evidence-based confrontation. They were left to navigate not just the fallout from the public exposure, but the private reality of rebuilding emotional safety. There was also a deeper, almost philosophical consideration: how much of a household's harmony depends on consistent respect for boundaries? How much of family life is impacted when one person refuses to recognize limits no matter the intention? Forrest and Sheena have learned firsthand that even love, care, and protection can become suffocating when they cross into intrusion. The emotional reflection wasn't just about the conflict, it was about how to move forward, how to rebuild trust in the environment, and how to maintain a united front in the face of continuing uncertainty. And yet, even in this moment of reflection and understanding, the question remained unresolved. Could the household ever return to a sense of normalcy? Or had the cumulative impact of repeated violations permanently altered the dynamic? Every glance at Molly, every mention of the viral clips, every reminder of the evidence they had presented kept that uncertainty alive. Forrest and Sheena could strengthen their unity, enforce their boundaries, and manage their responses. But whether the emotional atmosphere would ever feel entirely safe again remained a mystery. A tension-filled question that lingered over every decision, every interaction, and every day in the household. The dust had settled, or at least it seemed to have. Forrest and Sheena sat together, exhausted but resolute, having navigated one of the most intense confrontations of their lives. There was relief in the air, a sense that finally boundaries had been acknowledged, and for a fleeting moment, calm felt possible. The evidence had been presented, their voices had been heard, and the immediate tension with Molly had been confronted head on. For Sheena, the relief was tempered with residual anxiety, the kind that lingers after prolonged stress, where every sound or glance can trigger a memory of past intrusion. For Forrest, there was still the edge of anger, a burning awareness of all the lines that had been crossed before they finally stood their ground. The emotional complexity of the moment was palpable. They had achieved a victory of sorts, yet it was a victory shadowed by uncertainty. Molly's explosive outburst had demonstrated the intensity of her emotional investment, and even as the camera stopped rolling, the energy from that confrontation lingered like a charged storm cloud. The couple couldn't ignore the ripple effects. Social media had taken the story and amplified it into a global spectacle. Comments, reposts, trending hashtags, and viral clips had all made the drama larger than life, and each interaction, each reaction from fans and critics alike kept the tension simmering. Forrest and Sheena had faced the storm together, but the storm had not yet fully passed. Amid this relief and residual tension, anger also bubbled to the surface. Months of intrusion, financial interference, and emotional manipulation had brought them to this point, and there was a natural human response to the injustice of it all. Yet their anger was no longer aimless. It was grounded in clarity, anchored by evidence, and unified by their shared commitment to protecting their relationship and personal space. There was a fierce pride in how they had handled the situation, calm, collected, and united. They hadn't lashed out. They hadn't let the manipulations dictate their behavior. Instead, they had taken control, and that in itself was empowering. Shock, however, remained part of the emotional mix. Molly's unpredictability had left everyone on edge, and her threats of a countermove, cryptic hints across social media, and pointed remarks in interviews kept Forrest and Sheena, and by extension the audience, in suspense. No one knew exactly what she would do next. Would she attempt another dramatic escalation? Would she try to reclaim control behind the scenes? Or would she retreat, letting the viral outrage define her narrative? The unpredictability kept the tension alive, and it's exactly what made the story so compelling for viewers. Every new post, every new clip, Every possible maneuver could redefine the household dynamic in an instant. As they reflected privately, Forrest and Sheena began to consider their next steps, knowing that public attention wasn't going to fade overnight. They had learned that confrontation and exposure could bring accountability, but it also invited continued scrutiny and unpredictable reaction. The couple's strategy moving forward wasn't just about reacting, it was about anticipating, observing, and maintaining their unity no matter what Molly did next. Every decision carried weight, every action set a precedent, and every reaction would ripple through both the household and the public sphere. For viewers, this is where the real suspense lived. The immediate fallout has been addressed, but the ultimate resolution is still unknown. The household's emotional equilibrium is fragile, and the next twist could come at any moment. Will Molly escalate again? Will Forrest and Sheena manage to maintain control without further drama? Can trust and peace truly be restored after such a prolonged pattern of intrusion and emotional tension? These questions keep the story alive, leaving audiences invested in the next chapter, eager for answers. Before we wrap up, I want to hear from you. What would you do if you were in Sheena's position? Would you continue to enforce boundaries with such firmness, or try to find a different approach to prevent further conflict? How would you handle the pressure of public scrutiny while navigating personal dynamics at home? Your thoughts and speculation are part of the conversation. Comment below and let's hear your take. And don't forget, this isn't the end. The next video will explore Molly's next moves, the household dynamics as tension continues to simmer, and the ways Forrest and Sheena adapt to maintain their unity in the face of unpredictable challenges. Trust me, the story is far from over, and what comes next promises even more drama, emotional intensity, and shocking moments that will leave everyone talking. Stay tuned, stay engaged, and make sure to subscribe to TLC Drama Live so you don't miss the next chapter of this gripping saga. Your comments, theories, and reactions shape the conversation, and we'll be diving into every angle of what happens next, keeping the suspense alive for every viewer watching from start to finish. The drama continues, the stakes remain high, and the story is just getting started.